evening and welcome to our Sunday night service for March the 26th. Remember that we are in the season for the Annie Armstrong Easter offering. We're also taking up for our audio-visual fund and for our Operation Christmas Child. Anytime you can also donate to our food pantry. We always take any kind of food donations, especially breakfast items this month. And a great thing that you could be donating would be pancake mix that is complete, that just needs water. Dates to remember: April the 7th on Friday, our church office will be closed for Good Friday, and April the 9th, our Easter sunrise service will be on the square at 7 a.m. And Mike, if you'll put up our Young at Heart announcement, thank you so much. Young at Heart are making plans for their annual trip. This year it's going to be to Eureka Springs, Arkansas. The date is October 2 through 5, and if you're interested in going, use the sign-up sheet on the bulletin board over the water fountain. The deposit is $100 per person, $200 per couple for this trip to Eureka Springs. Let's go to the Lord in prayer as we begin our service. Lord, thank you so much for what you've done for us in our lives. Lord, we thank you so much for the many blessings that you've given us and the things that you've helped us study today. And Lord, help these things to be applied to our lives. And Lord, we ask you to be with us as we listen to the sermon to follow, Lord, that this sermon may be something that touches our heart. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Our call to worship tonight is Victory in Jesus. I heard an old story, how a Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his growing, of his precious blood's atoning. Then I repented of my sin and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me and I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing blood. I heard about his healing, how his cleansing power revealing, how he made the lame to walk again and caused the blind to see. And then I cried, "Dear Jesus, come and heal my broken spirit." And somehow Jesus came and brought to me the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me and I knew him, and all my love is Blessed be your name in the land that is plentiful, where your streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place. Though I walk through the wilderness, blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. Blessed be your name when the sun's shining down on me, when the world's all as it should be. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name on the road marked with suffering, though there's pain in the offering. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name. You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, Lord, blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your glorious name.
Amen.
Continue with The King is Coming. And we'll sing this twice. Oh, the King is coming. The King is coming. I just heard the trumpet sounding, and now his face I see. Oh, the King is coming. The King is coming. Praise God. He's coming for me. Oh, the King is coming. The King is coming. I just heard the trumpet sounding, and now his face I see. Oh, the King is coming. The King is coming. Praise God. He's coming for me. Thank you for your singing tonight. And you can be turning in your Bibles to the book of Exodus. And we're looking at chapter 1, verses 1 through 22, the bondage breaker. In Exodus chapter 1. No other name but the name of Jesus. No other name but the name
And thank you for that once again, Miss Melinda. And hopefully you have made your way to Exodus chapter 1. On Wednesday nights, we had been going through Hebrews chapter 11 and looking at some of the heroes of the faith. And we took a break when we got to the devotional book that Brother Gary put out and began going through that together. And now have gotten back into Hebrews chapter 11 on Wednesday nights. And we had made it to Moses and have been looking at what Hebrews had to say about him and his family and their walk of faith, the example that they set. And so now on Sunday nights, I want to look at certain passages from the book of Exodus that show us truths concerning God and His plan for the nation of Israel, and certainly what He was going to do in and through the nation of Israel, and what He can still do in us as individuals and through us as individuals that make up the church to spread the gospel, to evangelize the world. Because what we begin to see here in Exodus is that that very word means way out, going out, or departure. And there are still people out there tonight who need to understand that God has provided them a way out. They are under bondage to sin. They are dead in their trespasses and sin. They are on a road that leads to devastation and destruction, and eternally they will spend in bondage. They will spend that time in pain and agony and suffering that they don't have to, because God has provided them a way out. He has provided them a way to get out of that state. And so that's what we begin to see here in Exodus chapter 1, is that God is going to provide the bondage breaker. Now we know that in Exodus that will be Moses, but it is a picture to us of what God did for us at Calvary. And that's really what we begin to see here, is God is going to use Moses to be the bondage breaker for the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel was to be an example to the rest of the world of who God is. And through the nation of Israel, the Messiah would come. And He is the bondage breaker who has given us and equipped us with everything that we need to carry the gospel message into the world, so that others can know the bondage breaker, so that others can experience salvation, so that others can experience the forgiveness that we've experienced and the grace and mercy that we have experienced. And we should be thankful tonight that there is a way out, that God has provided a way out. And so we're going to get into some of that tonight as we introduce this and go along in Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to go back and pick up the first 7 verses in a minute, but for us to start out thinking about Him being the bondage breaker, I want us to start out reading verses 11 through 14. The Bible says, "Therefore they did not set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burden. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor." Let's pray. Lord, we come to you tonight. Once again, we ask you to honor the reading and preaching of your word. Lord, I pray that you would help us to understand tonight that you are the bondage breaker. And Lord, help us to share that message with others. Help us to boldly proclaim our faith. And Lord, that we would be the lighthouse that you have placed us here to be, that city set upon a hill that cannot be hidden. Lord, may we reflect your love, your mercy, and your grace in a world that desperately needs it. And Lord, we pray all these things now in Jesus' name. Amen. What we see on display here, and the purpose and the theme behind the book of Exodus is God's deliverance. This is a continuation of what had taken place in Genesis, and the author of the book of Exodus assumes that we are familiar with Genesis, and specifically with Joseph and what he did to set everything up, not only for the nation of Israel to be saved and to be preserved, because they were experiencing the famine just like the Egyptians did. And so that's what you begin to see in verses 1 through 7 is kind of a history of and a synopsis of what has already taken place and people who have already been mentioned in the book of Genesis. He said, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them." And so that gives us a picture of a span of history there that ended up in Genesis. And now whenever you get into verses 8 and following of chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, there is 400 years or so there that where the nation of Israel has been growing in Egypt, and they have been multiplying in Egypt, and they have began to overtake the Egyptians, or at least that's the perception that this Pharaoh is going to have. And that is why we begin to see some of what is going to take place in this chapter and in following chapters. And so God is going to provide deliverance of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. He will establish his covenant with Israel through Moses and even the construction of the tabernacle. Whenever we get here to chapter 1, we see Egypt at the height of its power. And not only do we see Egypt at the height of its power, but we have also been talking about a little bit about this on Wednesday nights. There were many of these people that were making up the Israelite nation who had blended in with the society around them. They had begun to compromise some of their beliefs, and they were not as dedicated as they should have been to God and the teachings of Joseph and what he had instructed them on, and the lessons that he had taught them, because we see there in verse 6 that generation had died out. And so they are in Egypt. And Egypt is at the height of its power, and the Pharaoh is wanting to exercise his power, and he's wanting to make sure that he retains his power and his authority and his grip and his control over everything and everyone around him. And so that is where we begin to see this oppression and this slavery put on the nation of Israel. And he kind of puts the target on them, right? He kind of places the target on their back. Israelites were specifically identified as foreigners, and they were to be feared and they were to be hated. When we begin to think about that, we all have that athlete that we like to root against, right? And we all can think about, there were people on other teams, we wanted to make sure that we beat them, that we defeated them. And even whenever we begin to think about in warfare, soldier of an enemy country is someone that is to be feared and to be hated. And that's what we begin to see. This target is on the nation of Israel. And we have to remember that there is a target on us. Satan wants us to remain bound. He wants us to remain defeated. He wants us to walk around in misery. But what we see in this chapter, and what we will see in these certain passages that we look at, is that God broke the bondage of the Hebrew people. And what I want us to understand, for those who are here tonight and anybody who may be watching or may see this later on, God can break your bondage. No matter how far gone you think you are, no matter how bad of an individual you think you are, no matter all the things that you could list that you have done that would disqualify you from experiencing God's grace and His mercy and His love and the freedom that is available through our faith in Him, I want you to understand that God can break your bondage. He can break those chains. He can set you free. He can make it possible for you to walk in newness of life and to be the warrior for Christ that He has created you to be. We do not have to walk around in bondage any longer. And what we see here with the nation of Israel and what they were experiencing begins in verse 8. He said, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." Now, we're not sure if this Pharaoh just didn't study his nation's history, or if he just refused to acknowledge that that had taken place and that that had happened. But the idea and the mindset behind it was he wasn't going to recognize that Joseph had played a part in not only saving the 70 people that originally came into the land from Israel, but he's not even acknowledging that Joseph played a part in saving Egypt and keeping them from starving during the famine and all those types of things. He said, we're not going to recognize that. We're not going to honor that. I don't know this Joseph. I never met this Joseph. I don't know who he is. I don't know who his brothers are. I don't know who his daddy was. And I don't care about these people. They are a threat to us. They are foreigners in our land. And he had in his mind, for whatever reason, that the nation of Israel, at the drop of a hat, would join in with some of the surrounding nations and help defeat them and overthrow him and take him off of the throne and out of power. Now, we don't know that the Israelite nation had ever shown that they were going to do anything like that, but that was the mindset. And that's why in verse 9 he said unto his people, "Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." Now think about what this Pharaoh was saying. The Israelite nation had been there. They weren't a part of the army. They weren't a part of any of that training. They were shepherds in the land. And yet this Pharaoh thinks they're mightier than we are. They didn't even know how to fight. They hadn't been trained how to fight. If the battle had actually broken out, they probably wouldn't have been very successful against Egypt and their army. But yet, here is the mindset behind it. They outnumber us. They are mightier than we are. He gets to verse 10 and he says, "Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." He begins to try to manipulate and plan and figure out a way to eliminate, exterminate this problem that is in their land. The problem is, the more he tries to exterminate them, the more he tries to eliminate them, the more they continue to multiply. Because what we do know about the nation of Israel at this time, while some of these people may not have been following all the laws and the different things that they were supposed to be following and may have blended in with the society around them to a certain extent, They were remembering what God had told them to do in the book of Genesis, and they were multiplying and filling up the earth. And so they were at least following that order, and they were listening to that command, and they were doing that they had been instructed to do. What we begin to see here is that the bondage is unwanted. The nation of Israel did not want to be in bondage. Whenever they first came to Egypt, they were treated with respect. They were treated with honor and dignity, and now they are being mistreated. Now they are being whipped. They are being beaten. They are being beaten down, and they are being worked hard, and all of these different things that they're experiencing. And they didn't ask for that. They didn't beg for that. The bondage of the Hebrews was unwanted. The bondage of the Hebrews, by the way, was predicted. This shouldn't have necessarily taken them by surprise when we begin to think about it, because Abraham was told that there would be a time when the nation of Israel would be in bondage. And that they would be in bondage for some 400 years. The bondage of the Hebrews was protracted. It lasted for a long time. Here's the thing about bondage. The bondage of the Hebrews was painful. Now, there are some people tonight who have never experienced salvation. There are some people tonight who have never surrendered their lives to Christ. There are some people tonight who have always been walking around in this bondage. And they don't have to walk around in this bondage. They can be set free. They can experience salvation. They can surrender their lives to Christ and experience forgiveness and walk in newness of life. But there are some people tonight who may be listening to this, who at some point in their life surrendered their life to Christ. But then, at some point, pick those chains back up and are walking around in bondage. And they don't have to be walking around. Shouldn't be walking around. And it's painful. Painful for them, painful for their family members to see and what they're going through. And that's what we have to understand, is that Satan doesn't want us to walk around in victory. He wants us to walk and think that we're still in bondage and think that we are still bound by these things and that we can't experience victory and we can't experience forgiveness. But we do not want bondage in our lives. And God has provided a way for us to experience victory. God has provided a way for us not to be walking around in bondage. And He is going to show the nation of Israel that they don't have to walk around in bondage. That they did not have to stay where they were at. But that He was going to lead them out. And He was going to make them a mighty nation. And He was going to use them to completely change the world and transform the world. And that's what we have to remember and understand as the church. God gave His Son to die on the cross for our sins so that we can experience forgiveness, so that we no longer have to walk around in bondage to the things of the world, and that we are to be living as representatives of God's kingdom, and we are to be making an impact and a difference. The world should be totally transformed by our lives and how we live and the message that we proclaim. It's what we see in the book of Acts. In the early church there, they were turning their world right side up because they were living the way that God intended for them to live. They were under the influence and the infusion of the Holy Spirit. It was evident there was something different about them. They were totally being transformed and walking in victory and walking in newness of life. Because what we see here in those opening verses that we read is the painful conditions that they were under. They were under taskmasters who were constantly afflicting them with burdens. There are people tonight who are walking around with burdens that they shouldn't be carrying, that they no longer have to carry, and all Satan is a taskmaster who is looking to afflict us. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. Pharaoh was convinced that once he started putting these burdens on the nation of Israel, that they would stop multiplying, that they would stop growing, that they would no longer be blessed. And God continued to bless them in the middle of these circumstances and conditions. It is a reminder to us as the church that the world is not going to get better. That doesn't mean that we stop. That doesn't mean that we give up. That doesn't mean that we place the responsibility on someone else. We have to understand that we know the bondage breaker, and it is our responsibility to share with others that they no longer have to walk around in bondage, that they no longer have to walk around dead in their trespasses and sin. And yes, the world may afflict us. Yes, the world may put us down. The world will fight against us. And we know that this ultimately is Satan and his minions. But yet we have been provided everything that we need and every piece of armor that we need to go into battle. And we are mightier through our faith in Jesus Christ. And we are more than conquerors through our faith in Jesus Christ. And ultimately what we know from reading through Exodus and what we've been looking at in Hebrews chapter 11 on Wednesday nights is that God was the ultimate bondage breaker. And he used Moses to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt. They saw Pharaoh and his army swallowed up by the Red Sea. They experienced all these things. They saw all these things. They had a story to tell. They had a song to sing. They offered up praise. But notice something else here. In verse 13 it said, the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt, in verse 15, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. The midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have you done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mightily. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. You'll notice in those verses, who was watching? The bondage is noticed, right? God noticed everything. He saw everything that was going on. Even if Pharaoh didn't say it, he knew what Pharaoh's mindset was. He knew what his heart, where his heart was at. He knew that there were people who were going to be crying out to him, that were praying. They were experiencing this bondage. They were going through this affliction. They were facing this rigor, and they were crying out to God. And God was watching. God had noticed God was listening. God noticed the bondage of His people in Egypt. God still notices the bondage of people today. And what the world needs is not only for us as the church to be presenting the message and sharing the gospel and telling of the bondage breaker, but we need to be praying that they will listen, that they will hear, that that message will penetrate their hearts, and that they will surrender, and that they will give up their lives to Christ, so that they no longer are walking around in bondage, but they are experiencing victory, and they are experiencing the blessings of a relationship that comes with God. Now, what we're going to notice is it didn't mean that their problems immediately went away. It doesn't mean that they still didn't face affliction. It doesn't mean that they still didn't walk through some territory that led to suffering and to temptation and testing and all these things. But the one thing they began to see more and more, and what we see more and more as we walk through some of these passages, is that God was always there. He was always watching. He was always listening. He was always providing for them. He was always taking care of them. He was wanting to not only lead them out of bondage, but lead them to a place of victory. He was wanting to lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey. He was wanting to lead them to a place where they would not experience all these things that they were experiencing. And that's what we have to understand, is that we are now representatives of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and there is coming a day where we're no longer going to be dealing with tests, and we're no longer going to be dealing with trials, and we're no longer going to get those phone calls of loved ones who have passed away, and we're no longer going to get those phone calls of people who are dealing with sickness and disease and all of these things. We have a deed to a mansion waiting for us. Waiting for us. God knows what you're going through tonight. He knows what you're enduring tonight. And if you wake up in the morning, He knows what you'll face tomorrow. He knows everything. He sees everything. He has never left us. He has never forsaken us. He sticks closer to us than a brother. We need to remember the promises of God. There were those that we will see along the way that remembered the promises. They were following God's direction. They were listening for God's voice in the middle of it all. And that's what we need to do. In the middle of all the noise, in the middle of everything else that's going on around us, we need to listen for God. Let Him speak. Do what He says. Trust in His promises. Because what we see here is not only is the bondage unwanted, it's noticed, and it can be broken. When we begin to look at what takes place here in these early chapters in the book of Exodus, it seems like the odds were totally stacked against the nation of Israel. The more they multiplied, the more Pharaoh persecuted. He added more work to them. He mistreated them even more. He then had the midwives come in and tell them that they had to murder all the male children. Then when that didn't work, he told the families, if you have a son, you have to throw him in the Nile River. And yet God broke the bondage. What we have to understand tonight, as we close out, is that God can break the bondage in your life. Moses would be born and would eventually be used as the bondage breaker. Jesus was born and ultimately became the bondage breaker. He has made it possible for us to experience victory. He has made it possible for us to walk in newness of life, and He has made it possible for us to live by faith and to walk by faith, regardless of what it may seem like our circumstances are, regardless of what it is that we may be facing or going through. We must continue to walk, move forward, progress, grow, mature, and share hope with those who are still in bondage. To show them, pray with them, pray for them, that they would surrender their lives to Christ and experience forgiveness. That they could experience being set free, so that they could share the message with others, and they could be discipled and disciple others. Be thankful for the bondage breaker tonight. Share your story as often as you can. Let's pray. Lord,